Hey, Sarah. Good to see you. I was like, oh, let me take her class. It's happening today.
So nice to see you. Welcome.
I know, you too. I get the My Jewish Learning emails, and I was like, oh my goodness, let me actually take a class with you, because like I've never done that yet. So yay.
All right. Good afternoon. It sounds like I just learned from our guest, Sarah, today that we're on the My Jewish Learning email, which is fabulous and noteworthy and wonderful. I'm Rabbi Jessica Spitalnik-Mates, and we're thrilled to have you join us in whatever form you're with us through our Zoom, on our live stream, or on our YouTube. When you can take a teacher that you have loved and bring them to your congregation to teach, it is truly a joy. And that is the case for me with Rabbi Sarah Mulhern. She serves as Base LNCLN, a Jewish home for college students and young adults in Chicago. And she's a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute, of which I am an alumni of and love tremendously, and was part of a program she did under her role as head of the Created Equal Project, working on topics related to gender, ethical leadership, and moral use of power. And I've come to Sarah personally and professionally to process a lot of those issues that have to do with those topics. And she's an incredible, wise, and brilliant resource. She was ordained by the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College and received private rabbinic ordination from Daniel Landes. She has a master's in Jewish education from Hebrew College and an alumni of many programs, including Yeshivat Hadar and the Wexner Graduate Fellowship. She lives in Chicago, which she's told me is 6 degrees today, which is going to be warm compared to the -7 they're expecting tomorrow with her husband, Rabbi Will Friedman, and their wonderful children. So I was complaining it was like in the 40s, and then I've just looked at 69 now. So how dare I? But anyway, welcome everyone, however you're joining us. And Sarah, we're thrilled to have you for our last session with us. And thanks to Jake, Cantor Jake, our amazing producer as well.
Thank you, Rabbi Jessica. It's amazing to continue to learn with you and from your community. And like I said before, folks sign on, next time you'll have to bring me in person so I can enjoy some of that cold 60-degree weather. It's really good to see some familiar faces, both from our previous sessions and from other times and spaces in my lives. I'm really happy to have one more chance to learn with you all. So just to reorient a little bit for our final session, when we first learned together, so 2 weeks ago, we focused on the question of how do we healthily and ethically broaden our community's sense of who can be a leader or who is a great leader, and also broaden the stories about how that person behaves. What does actually leadership look like in ways that are more diverse and more robust? And then in our second time, we thought a little bit about what we actually want those leaders to do for our communities. In particular, how do we want them to focus their energies on a spectrum that we kind of sketched out between a kind of conservation instinct, an instinct to preserve that which has been good about our communities up until the present, through to a more innovative, more radical jump into the change and make more change. Where do we want our leaders to fall? So that's sort of where we've been. And today, in terms of our final session together, here's where I hope we'll go. So I want to talk about what gets in the way. What are the problems that sort of gunk up our best intentions for improving our communities? So obviously we all want our communities to be changing and growing to be the best, most ethical, most compelling versions of themselves. I have actually tried going into rooms and asking groups of people, groups of Jews, who here wants your community to be a just place? Who here here wants your community to be a place that is ethical for people of all genders. And you'll be shocked to hear that everybody raises their hands, right? Everybody wants that. So why doesn't it just happen if everybody wants it, right? Clearly there's lots of different answers, but I think that a very central one and often overlooked, but really very core one is this. All change, even great changes, even changes that we desire, that we know will make our communities better, all change creates loss, right? All change creates loss, and loss creates resistance. So that's the sentence we're going to unpack today. All change creates loss, and loss creates resistance. So that's what we want to explore. So how come, why does change create loss for people involved in the change, even people who support the change? And why does that breed resistance? And how does that resistance show up, again, even among those who ostensibly support the changes? And how do the ways in which that resistance show up really prevent the work from going forward, often derail the change entirely? And what can we, as committed members of Jewish communities who want to move towards a place of justice, do about the ways in which that resistance often sends things off the rails? So in terms of having that conversation, we're going to focus on one biblical text, just sort of like one story from one part of one chapter from the book of Numbers, which I really think is just an excellent case study of exactly this kind of problem. You don't even have to dig deep. It's right there on the surface, this problem playing out between the Israelites and their leaders. So we're going to look at that text just on its own to see what we can take from it as interpreters and readers of the text. And then I want to show you a series of different commentaries, each of which I think interprets or maybe embodies a particular way of interpreting this set of problems, different kinds of ways of thinking about this set of problems. And we're going to have some time at the end also to discuss, how have you seen these kinds of issues play out in your life and your community? So that's the plan. Does that sound good at this point? Anybody confused or need clarification just about the sort of basic plan? We're good. Get some thumbs up here. Yeah, Judy.
Just a quick comment. Just a quick comment here.
Yeah, thanks.
Your opening is so good, and I think that there are things that we think everybody wants, and then once you get into the weeds, you see it's nuanced by gender, by geography, by different things. And for me, just when you're talking about this, even what happened, in Texas and Colleyville a few weeks ago, as a female rabbi, I'm contemplating the ability to pick up and throw a chair because that became part of the story. Or who would I have led into the synagogue, and safety and things like that. So I think your point is so important because we think we have like a group response to wanting what we think is ethical and moral and right and good for all, but even the lens we look through is so different based on, among many things, gender.
Yes, Rabbi Jessica, that is such a powerful piece to bring. And we're going to go deeper into that, which is to say, again, you go into a room and say, who wants justice? Very few people are going to say, not me. But we're operating with really different definitions of what justice is. And we're also, we have really different places that we're seeing these stories and these structures from, which may impact our sense of the urgency, may impact our sense of the stakes. I watched, and not to get too derailed, but I watched what was coming in Colleyville, realizing that I'm running a Jewish community that meets in my home with my children here, which totally, sort of transformed how I experienced that story. And each of us is a particular universe. So where we sit in the community, even if we all say, we're on board for the same process, who we are, the identities we carry, and where we sit in the story, 100%. You couldn't say it better than you did, Rabbi Jessica. It's just a totally different story. Yes, that's powerful. Let's just hold a little space for that thought. Okay. Anybody else clarifying something you need to know before we can move forward? Okay, let's take a breath with that big idea. I want to start with one very short text. It's hardly even a text. It's like a quote But it's like, as I'm thinking about these issues, this is the quote that is like really framing my thinking. And it's from, again, it's not even a book, it's like a booklet, a little booklet, but written by some really important teachers in my life, primarily Shifra Bronsnick and her sort of partner in thought and crime, Didi Goldenhar, and Marty Linsky, who is a professor at Harvard Business School. And they wrote this little booklet in 2008, which is sort of applying theories that Marty and his colleague Ron Hafetz developed theories that they developed in the context of Harvard Business School, which they call adaptive leadership. It's a certain way of thinking about leadership, and taking that sort of way of thinking about leadership and applying it to the specific problem or challenge of having a more gender equitable Jewish community and having more gender equitable Jewish organizations. And so let me just share my screen so you can all see this like great little quote. So here's what they wrote. People can see? Yeah, it worked. Great. So there is an idea that people do not like change. Wrong. Winning the lottery will certainly change your life, but no one gives away a winning lottery ticket. People resist significant change when they experience it as a threat or a potential loss, no matter how good they think it will be for others or even for themselves. So you could push on this. I think there probably are people who struggle with the changes in their life if they're winning a lottery, but I think the basic idea is very helpful here, right? It's not change that's hard for humans. It's the threats and the losses that are wrapped up in change that are hard for humans. So just like, to really underscore, because this is everything we're going, right? People resist the threats or the potential losses, no matter how good they think it will be for others, right? No matter how altruistic they feel about like, this is going to be really good for the people in my community, or even for themselves, right? Even changes that people think will be good for them, they still experience and act on the resistances around the ways in which it creates threat or loss. So I want to just unpack that because I think it's like a big idea in a few words. So let's say you are trying to make your community a place with more gender equity, and everybody agrees that's a lovely idea. According to this, there are 3 pieces that you cannot overlook if you want to do that work, and they are still true no matter how on board everybody says they are. First, you will likely have people in your organization or community who, even though I agree with where you're trying to go, also see correctly that those changes will cause losses for them. And these could be all sorts of different kinds of losses. So it could be concrete losses of power, right? If you give more power to some people, the people who had power before are going to feel that they've lost some power. It could be concrete losses of resources, right? If you're going to redistribute how the resources get handed out. But often it's actually sort of softer but equally powerful losses around identity, around competency and normalcy, right? I know what my role is in the old system. I know how to play by the rules of the game. And now you're changing the rules of the game. That's a loss for people, right? The loss of the sense of comfort and normalcy and competence. And they see that as great as the outcome might be, they can see those losses and they are not wrong. Okay, so that's thing 1. Thing 2 is that this sense of loss will consciously, or actually often unconsciously, usually lead people to resist and try to derail the changes that you are trying to implement in your community. Again, even if they sign on in theory. And I would add that these dynamics actually get even stronger, right? This is sort of an insight from psychology. These dynamics get even stronger when people already feel that they are destabilized and they are already feeling loss from other unrelated external things going on that are totally outside your project and outside your control. But if people are already feeling destabilized and already feeling lost, they actually tend to have a much lower tolerance for holding loss and holding risk. So obviously right now, right, almost 2 years into a pandemic, people are feeling more destabilized and more lost. And so they have even less tolerance for the losses in any kind of change process. That's 2. And 3, coming out of this is the assumption, and this is where Shifra and her colleagues are going, that if you do want to create culture change in your community, even change that you really can't avoid making in a healthy way, you're going to have to find a way of dealing with the sense of loss and the resistance it engenders. You can't just say, well, tough for them. You're going to have to work through this, and you're going to have to find a way to respond to it. So that's really framing my thinking. And with that, I want to look at this biblical story that I told you we were going to go into. And I think, as I said, the dynamics are not even below the surface. They're just right there. We're going to see them. So just so we all have the same context before I throw up the text, what we're going to look at here is the story of the Israelites, right, who have escaped Egypt, and they've traveled for many, many months through the desert, and they have reached the borders of the promised land. Right? That's where they were all going. That's where they wanted to go. And they send some forward scouts to check out the land. And we're going to pick up at the moment where the scouts return to give their report. Okay, so that's where we're coming in. They've been traveling and been traveling. They're right at the border, and we're going to pick up for the report from the forward scouts. And in case you haven't heard this one before, despite the fact that I assume everyone in the Israelite camp would agree in theory that going to the promised land has been the goal all along and is a better plan than remaining in limbo in the desert forever and probably dying of thirst, the whole thing is going to fall apart for exactly the reasons we've been discussing. And so what I want to do is take a sensitive read and look at sort of why does that happen? So I'm going to ask Judy, will you be my first reader when I throw up the text? Yes. And as we read, here's the questions I want you to have in your mind. So what are the sources of the resistance that people articulate? Why are they resistant? And what are the attempts that the leaders make to sort of move through those concerns, and do they work? So what's the resistance? What do the leaders do about it? And does it work? Yeah. Questions make sense? Okay. Let me put the text up. Okay. Great. Judy, can you read that first piece? Oh, you're on mute. Just please unmute yourself.
To start at the report.
Yes, exactly. And those are my, my titles. They're not actually.
And Sarah, I threw the questions in the chat just to keep them.
Oh, thank you so much, Rabbi. That's perfect.
At the end of 40 days, they returned from scouting the land. They went straight to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. And they made their report to them and to the whole community as they showed them the fruit of the land. This is what they told him. We came to the land you sent us to. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there, Amalekites, a nation that has previously attacked the Israelites, dwell in the Negev region. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites inhabit the hill country, and Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, "Let us by all means go up, and we shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We cannot attack the people, for it is stronger than we." Thus they spread a bad report, I lost my place, among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, saying, "The country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are men of great size. We saw the Nephilim, perhaps giants there, and the Anakites are part of the Nephilim. And we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them."
Okay, beautiful. So here's the report that the scouts bring back. And they are clearly quite resistant to going into the promised land, despite the fact that that was the goal and the plan all along. Why, just Judy, since you read, why in sort of just narrowly in the text, what are they saying is the problem? What is the source of their resistance?
Well, they're very afraid when they hear the size of what they're coming up against. The walls, the people are giants.
Great. They're afraid. They're afraid that they actually won't succeed. There seems to be an argument here. We can't possibly win, so why even try, right? And I'll say, as someone who has tried to shift communities in all sorts of ways around issues of justice, this comes up all the time. We can't possibly win, so why even try, right? And also, Judy, I think you're right to lead with fear, right? They are afraid. And I think this last sentence is so suggestive. we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. And so we must have looked to them, right? They have a very low estimation of their own power. And they assume that that's also how their enemies would feel about them, right? So they go in already from a place of total fear and assumption that they will lose. Okay. And we have like one little attempt from the leadership here, right? Caleb hushed the people and said, let us by all means go up. So just to notice, what's his strategy here? He's just kind of trying to shut down the dissent, right? He's hushing them. Okay, let's get the next part of the story, the response, as I titled it. Sarah, will you read this next paragraph for us?
Sure. The response. The whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites rallied against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in the land of Egypt, the whole community shouted at them. Or if only we might die in this wilderness. Why is the Lord taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. And they said to one another, let us head back for Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembled congregation of the Israelites.
Great, beautiful. So this is, I think, a slightly different argument for why they shouldn't go up. Sarah, do you want to just, in your own words, what are the people saying? Why don't they want to try to go into the land?
Because it's hard out there. It's, there's no water, it's hot, there's no food or little food in there.
Okay, no, great. Okay, so let's sharpen that. That would be a reason to go up to the land, right? You don't want to stay in the desert. Right. But interestingly, they're saying they're not afraid of death. They're saying it's better to die in the wilderness or to die back in Egypt where we were slaves, right? What they're afraid of is violent death, right? Okay. They're saying, if our choices are die of thirst in the wilderness or die in battle in the land, we take the die of thirst, right? We don't want to die violently. And specifically, the sort of focus of their concern seems to be what's going to happen to the vulnerable members of their communities, to their wives and children, right? That they're afraid that they will be taken into slavery, right? And they say, we better that we would all die than that we should die by the sword and our wives and children should be taken into slavery. So, fear, but a little bit of a different fear from the scouts who seem to be afraid about sort of losing the battle. They're like, what's going to happen to our children? Our children are going to be taken captive, like not an acceptable thing to risk. Right. Very powerful, reasonable thing to be worried about. And then what's the response of the leadership? Moses and Aaron just kind of like literally fall over and just let it like wash past them, right? They don't respond. They don't attempt to engage. They just like fall on their faces in front of the community. Okay. Other, anybody seeing anything here that I'm not articulating about why they're resisting? Yeah, we feel like we've got it. Okay, let's get just this last piece. So this is the attempt of two of the scouts who are on team go up into the land to respond to this situation that's happening. Let's see who hasn't read yet. Natalie, can you read this last paragraph for us?
And Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Yefuneh, of those who had scouted the land, tore their clothes and exhorted the whole Israelite community. The land that we traversed and scouted is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, God will bring us unto that land, a land that flows with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only you must not rebel against the Lord. Have no fear then of the people of the country, for they are our prey. Their protection is departed from them, but the Lord is with us. Have no fear of them. and the whole community threatened to pelt them with stones.
Okay, so this is the leadership response. And I think we can start by saying it doesn't work very well. I think if you're trying to get your community to do something and it ends with them pelting you with stones, you can chalk that up as not a successful community organizing attempt. So the question is why? What do they do and why does it fail? So I see basically three arguments that they're making, right? The first is that they try to remind the people how great the land is, right? The land is flowing with milk and honey. It's an exceedingly good land. And I think it's unsurprising that that's not persuasive because, of course, everybody agreed with that from the beginning. We all knew it was good land. That was not the question. Even the spies who say that we shouldn't go up say it's an excellent land flowing with milk and honey. The question is not whether the land is good. The question is whether it's worth the risk. So that argument fails because it's not responding at all to the concerns of the resistance, right? So that's thing one. The second thing is they basically yell at people not to be afraid, that, do not be afraid. And I will say in my experience as a community leader, and my experience as a parent and my experience as a human, telling people not to be afraid of something that they are in fact afraid of is just never worked for me. Maybe it's worked for one of you. And then there is the third argument, which I think it's a little more surprising that it doesn't work, right? So the third argument is God is on our side. Right. Don't rebel against God because God is on our side. So I think that one is a little more surprising that it doesn't work because, the people have just experienced God taking them out of Egypt. So they have experience in a very first-hand way that maybe you and I don't have of God's ability to intervene in history and to make it possible for a weaker group to be successful against a more powerful one, right? They've just experienced the Exodus from Egypt only a few months ago. But it seems like also the argument God is on our side doesn't work. And I guess my hypothesis there would be that, they've only been in relationship with God for a few months. They haven't built the necessary trust. They can't rely on that argument yet because they just don't have the foundation. So none of those strategies really work. And the people end up pelting their leaders with stones, which, as I say, is not a good outcome. So I want to look now at, like I said, a few different commentaries, which really, now that we've sort of established what's the simple reading here of what happens and what goes wrong and what the response is, I want to look at a few different commentaries, which I think I chose because they represent different kind of streams of interpretation of this story. And each one really highlights a different way that we could understand what the problem is, and therefore a different way of how a leader might respond to this kind of resistance emerging from fear and emerging from loss. So this first text that I'm going to share with you it's from the Babylonian Talmud. So those who've been here in previous weeks, this is a rabbinic text developed with material, say, through the 1st and 5th through 5th centuries in what is now Iraq. And this text is going to ask the question, what's going on with the spies? Why do they give the report that they do? So let me just read it to you and we'll get it on the table. So the Talmud says, and they returned from touring to spy out the land, and they went and they came. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the structure of the verse likens their going to their coming. Okay, so it says they went and then they came. So he says there's something that's similar about the way in which they went that's similar to the way in which they came back. Okay, just as their coming was with wicked counsel, so too their going into the land originally was with wicked counsel. Okay, so what the Talmud is telling us is you might have thought that this was a story about scouts who went in with all the best intentions. They went in really on team enter the promised land, but what they saw there scared them and changed their mind. The Talmud says no. From the beginning of the story, when they left to go on their scouting journey, they already planned to try and derail it. Okay, so now what's the evidence? The Torah states, and they told him, and they said, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. And then it is written, however, the people that dwell in land are fierce, right? So we remember the presentation that the spies made. They first emphasized the goodness of the land and the bounty of the land. And then they went on to this whole long piece about how scary the current inhabitants are. So the Talmud asks, why did they first praise the land and then slander it? Like, if they wanted to take this whole thing down, why didn't they only share the bad parts? Why did they first sell all the good parts? Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Meir, any slander that does not contain as its origin some element of truth ultimately will not stand. So what's the idea here? If you want to slander somebody or tell a nasty, horrible rumor about somebody and you want people to believe you, it's smart to build first from something that's a little bit true and then add onto it all the nasty, not true stuff or the unfair interpretations. And that is going to be a more successful strategy, right? So this Talmudic interpretation really sees the spies as from the beginning quite nefarious, right? They only go because they're trying to take this whole project down from the first place. And they only say anything nice about the idea of entering the land because they know that's going to get them the buy-in to say all the nasty things about why it won't work, right? Their intentions were bad from the beginning. The way they went in was the same way they came back. They were bad at the beginning and they were bad at the end. And anything that they did that seemed helpful or seemed like they were on board was actually just cover because they were always planning to sabotage you. So say like, this is possible. And I don't want to discount it, right? If we're back to our metaphor, if you're trying to, elevate a new female leader in your community, you might find out that some people in your community are just like unrepentant sexists. And they were kind of trying to take it down from the very beginning. And of course, this does happen sometimes. But I would say the problem is that once you've adopted this frame of interpretation and labeled some person or group of people who are resisting your attempt to change as just like bad, they're just the enemy. So now you've narrowed your possible responses because your only option is just to fight them and try to beat them. And sometimes, again, that might be necessary, but it really constrains you, right? You have now no ability to work with them, to try and change their mind, to bring them along. And that, in fact, maybe more frequently might also be necessary. Okay, so that sort of possible one is like, they're just bad people. And like, sometimes, yes, but that's really going to shut down any work that you can do with those people. Okay, so that's sort of like interpretation one. And now I want to show you another really different take from the Zohar. So let's just pull that one up. So for those who are not familiar, the Zohar is the sort of foundational text of Jewish mysticism. The question of when and where it was created is a bit controversial, but probably medieval Spain. And it is very loosely organized around commenting on different biblical stories, although it, as a mystical text, goes lots of interesting places. And here it is going to tell a really different story about what is motivating those spies. So here's the Zohar. They, meaning the spies, were all righteous and leaders of the Israelites, but they developed a bad counsel, right? So this is a totally different story. They started out as good guys. These were the good guys, right? Jessica, we've talked about this. They're the good guys and they were righteous and they were the leaders of the community. And something went off that they developed this bad perspective. Why? What happened? Why did they take on this bad counsel? Because they said to themselves, if the Israelites enter the land, they will remove us from being leaders and Moshe will appoint new leaders. We only merited to be leaders in the desert. Okay. Wow. So what are they saying? They're saying we're leaders in our community right now. And we can see that if big foundational things about our community changes, the community will need new leaders and it won't be us anymore, right? We were the right leaders for this sort of desert context, but in the land, we're going to need totally different leaders. And they said, well, we like being the leaders. We don't want to let go of our leadership. We don't want to let go of our power, right? So these were good guys. They were righteous, but when push came to shove and they saw that maybe they were going to be dethroned, that's when they started to create this bad counsel, right? So this is a totally different read than the first one that we saw from the Talmud. It assumes the scouts actually were very good and they had all the best intentions, but they got stuck, right? They got stuck in their fear that in the land, in Canaan, they wouldn't have the power or the important role that they used to have in the desert. Even though the desert is a less good place to be, they like being in charge in that less good place to be, right? So I think there's two possibilities, and they're really different. One possibility is that they're wrong, right? That actually, in fact, the community is still going to need them to be leaders in the new world order. And if so, then what Caleb and Joshua should have done was to sort of sit them down and help them feel secure and let them know that they're still going to be needed, right, in the land, right? So it's like sitting down, we're elevating this new female leader, and you sit down the older male leader and you say, like, don't worry, we are still so grateful to you for what you did for our community, and we still need you, and we still need your gifts, and here's the way that you're going to fit in, and you are not going to be sidelined. Like, we still need your gifts for the community. That's one story. On the other hand, it's also possible that they're right. Right? It's actually possible that they are right, that they were only needed to be leaders in this time, and that they won't get to be leaders in the new situation, right? Anytime you shift the structure, you shift the culture, some people are going to have more power than they had before. And sort of by definition, some people are going to have less power than they had before. So that's a real challenge, right? How do you get the people who are going to have to share power that they were used to not sharing, or going to actually have to cede some of their roles? How are you going to get them to feel good about that, or at least okay about that, okay enough not to sabotage this change that they agree is for the better, right? They know that the community needs to go to the promised land, but it's really hard to let go of feeling useful and important. And helping people through that change is really, really hard work. Okay, so I want to get one more voice on the table, and then we'll sort of pause with this, like seeing different interpretations, right? So we had interpretation 1, they're just bad guys and you just have to beat them. We had interpretation 2, which is like, they like being in charge and it's hard for them to let go, okay? And that's like a real thing. I don't want to make fun of that. That's like serious, okay? And now the third one. So this is from the Akedat Yitzchak, who's sort of a mystically inclined interpreter of Bible, a little bit later. We're now moving forward in history. And this text, I'm just going to say it's like a little bit hard to understand. It's kind of mystical and opaque. So I'm going to explain it. So don't worry if on first blush, it doesn't make sense to you. Okay. So the Akedat Yitzchak says, Caleb and Joshua wanted to ascend, in other words, wanted to go up into the land in order to bask in the divine light. So there's sort of a mystical belief here that some of us may really not experience, and some of us maybe have experienced, that there is something special about the land of Israel, and that when you're there, you kind of have a different kind of closeness to the divine. And Caleb and Joshua are like hungry for that, and they want to go be in that space. And so they said, let us go up and we will conquer it, for we are able to do so. They had a different spirit and sought to follow God and reject the uncontained and unbounded life, and to choose a life of the limits of Torah. Okay, so what is the text saying? It's saying that in the desert, there was a kind of uncontained and unbounded life. Like everything was sort of like a free for all in the desert. God is like right there as a pillar of fire or pillar of smoke, depending on the time of day. There's not really like structure or rules. And they want to choose the life of the limits of Torah in the land. In other words, they're sort of aware that when they get into the land of Israel, there's going to be a different system. There's going to be a temple, and there's going to be rules and rituals and procedures. And they're ready to let go of the sort of wild, unbounded life of the desert and choose this life of limits and structures in the land, and go and inherit the land of life. So they're ready to make that transition of culture. But maybe not everybody is, right? Right. The idea is that in the desert, there's a certain kind of unboundedness, which this text describes as a bad thing, but maybe some of the Israelites liked, right? There's a certain kind of freedom. There's a certain kind of direct access to the divine. And that's all going to be replaced with a much more structured system, right? You have to go through the temple. You have to go through the structures of Jewish law, right? In the desert, God's just kind of hanging out all the time. And in Israel, there's going to be like visiting hours, right? So I think this is like an interesting possibility. And in some ways, I think it's even the most common one I see when I work with communities, right? It's not that the people who are resisting are bad people. And it's not that they actually have some concrete, position or financial thing that they're going to lose. It's more of an identity loss, right? The way that we are living in our current situation even with all its flaws, like we don't have enough water, like the desert's not great, but it's working for people, right? More than that, whether or not it's working, people have their identity wrapped up in the way things are now, this sense of normalcy, as we said before, right? A sense of feeling competent. I know what the rules of our culture are. I know how to function in that context. And now you're going to just like play a different game and I'm going to be a beginner again, right? I'm not going to be competent anymore. I don't know if I'm ready to transition to this new world, even if maybe it has some advantages. Like that transition is hard, right? So that's actually a lot to give up, even to get to something that's theoretically better. To have to start all over, learning a new culture is really a big identity loss for people. And this happens really all the time. Even if you can't point to some sort of concrete loss, like you were the head of this board and now you're not going to be anymore. This loss of the sense of self, this loss of the sense of competence, this loss of a sense of normalcy is a huge loss. And actually almost by definition, it always comes with change. Okay. So we've laid out here 3 possible answers. Like, why did the Scouts try to take down this whole promised land thing, right? Are they bad? Are they worried about their leadership roles? Or are they just like having trouble making the cultural transition? 3 really different takes, right? And I think it's important to notice that like you can sort of tell each of these in like a skeptical way or a generous way. And I think like, let's tell it generously, right? Like they have real, genuine concerns about identity losses, about power losses, at least in the second 2 interpretations. And certainly if we go back to the simple sense of the text, when we just looked at the verses, that people have real, genuine concerns about harms to themselves, about harms to their children. These are real things to be worried about. And then, you know, in the face of that, we have leaders who just kind of like get bowled over, like literally physically bowled over in the case of Moses and Aaron. And then we have other leaders, Caleb and Joshua, who just kind of try to hush it, you know, try to silence the dissent or kind of yell at people and tell them not to be afraid. Right. They don't engage at all with these like real, serious, genuine sources of resistance and of loss. And, you know, I really think it's not shocking that they end up getting pelted with stones. So I just, you know, one little step deeper, I want to look at just one final text. And this text is the Talmud trying to sort of flesh out this last piece, which is like, now that we have a really good sense of what's going on for the people and for the Scouts, let's like look at the experience of the leaders, like what's going on for Joshua and Caleb, what are the strategies that they use, and like why did they reach for these strategies that are kind of so obviously insufficient. So let's just look at this very last text. Very high tech, sharing my screen. Okay, last text. We're back in the Talmud, different part of the Talmud, Sota. And the Talmud is going to interpret the verse that we saw where it said that Caleb hushed the people before Moses. And they're going to do a little play on words. So the Hebrew word for hush is vayahas. And they're going to say, actually, when it says hushed, actually, it means persuaded, hesitan. It sort of sounds similar. Okay. But the point is, it sounds like from the simple reading of the text that he's just trying to shut them down, but actually he was trying to persuade them. He thought he was being persuasive. Okay. So this already is interesting. What happens when the people experience the response of the leadership as just silencing them? The leader thinks that he's being persuasive, right? Thinks that he's being discursive. Okay. So what happened? So Joshua began. And as he was speaking, they said to him, should this person who has a severed head speak? So what's meant here by severed head? Severed head here means that he doesn't have any children. And I want to just hold that our community is often really terrible to people who don't have children, and that this text is painful from that perspective. But here, I think it's actually quite relevant. They're saying to him, our fear is that our children are going to be in danger, and you're telling us not to worry about it, but you don't have children. So you can't connect to our fear. You don't understand us. You're not seeing us. You're not hearing us. And so the people just can't even listen to Joshua. They're like, you don't share this fear. We can't even talk to you about it. Okay. So that's the first thing that happens. And then Caleb is like, okay, Now's my moment. I'm the leader. I'm going to step into the breach. And he says, if I speak, they will also say something about me and stop me from speaking. Right. So he gets that there's like stakes here, that if he steps up and tries to help the people through this fear, that they might also say equally horrible things to and about him as this sort of horrible, unjust thing that they've just said about Joshua. Like he knows that they might drag him through the mud. But he tries anyways. Nevertheless, he said to them, and is that the only thing that this son of Amram, Moses, has done to us? So he sort of starts in a little tricky way. He says like, yeah, you want to complain about Moses about this? Well, is that the only thing he's done to us? Right. And the people think he's going to say more nasty things about Moses. And they're excited about that because they are like in a dragging Moses through the mud mood. And so, right, they thought he wanted to relate something to the discredit of Moses. And so they were silent. That's how he got them to listen to him, by pretending he was on their side. And then he said to them, Moses took us out of Egypt and he split the sea for us and he fed us manna. And if he says to us, build ladders and climb to the heavens, should we not listen to him? We should go up at once and possess it. Okay, so this is an interesting argument, right? In the simple reading of the text, the argument was trust God. But Caleb here is saying trust Moses. And actually it's a little crazy. He says, Moses took us out of Egypt and Moses split the sea for us and Moses fed us manna, when in fact, those are all things that God did, right? He sort of exaggerates how indebted the people are to Moses, almost as if he's saying, I know you can't possibly bring yourselves to trust God, but let's trust Moses. Like, even if he says something to us that seems crazy, like we've been through this incredibly traumatic, incredibly insane experience of the Exodus with Moses. Like, hasn't Moses like earned credit in your books? And on the one hand, I think that the Talmud is trying to make him more persuasive, right? He tries to understand where the people are at. He makes this argument of trust and of relationship. On the other hand, it still sort of boils down to like, just trust me, right? He still doesn't really engage with the really legitimate claims that the people are making. And I always wonder when I look at this story and when it comes along in the Torah reading and looking at this Gemara, this Talmudic passage, how would this story have played out differently if the leaders of the Jewish people could have taken their people's fears and losses seriously? We could have skipped that whole 40 years in the desert thing and just gone straight into the land if the leaders would only have been willing to pause and say like, yeah, this is really scary. I hear you, And I think often that when we're talking about community work, and this is where I'll pause and sort of open it up for questions and comments, there is a feeling that if we stop and we make space for the people who are voicing dissent and we validate those people, there's a fear that we're just going to give them a platform, right? So you're just sort of shooting yourself in the foot. You're like letting the people who are against you have more airtime. But I think this is a great example of a place where maybe if you'd given them a little space, you actually could have brought them into the work. I think there's also an argument that I often hear, especially, folks who are very much, with me in trying to move the Jewish community forward on these issues. There's a sense of like, oh, you're going to just give more time and more energy to the people who were already benefiting from the old unjust system. Like, you're going to give more airspace to those people. Like, let's hear from the people who've been harmed by the old unjust system. And I think that's like a very, very true and important insight. But again, I think this story and the insight of Shifra Bronsnick that we started with really says like, yeah, seems unfair to give even more space to the people who have been winning. And yet, if you can't give space to the fears of loss, and the real losses that we're asking people who have been comfortable to sustain in order to make change in our communities, the whole thing's going to blow up. So whether or not it seems fair, you got to give space to the people who have to get through this transition. And whether or not you like it, that might be the only way to do the work. So, this case study leaves me feeling both like there's a lot of richness in thinking about how we can help our communities get out of the wilderness and into the promised land, and sort of a sadness that this is what it looks like. But this is human nature, right? If you're asking people to make big changes, there are losses. And if we as a community can't hold some respect for that, we don't get to the promised land, or at least we don't get there for a whole nother generation and 40 years of dying in the desert to, beat my dead horse of my metaphor here. So I'll pause there and just open it up. Responses to sort of this case I'm making, questions, comments. What do you got for me? Yeah, Judy.
Well, I understand what you just said about giving people space, the people that are opposing whatever the leaders are proposing. But does it really work? Are they really going to listen? People get so, for Brent that they're not going to listen.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's why that first voice that just says, no, they're bad guys, is actually an important voice in this paradigm I'm laying out. Like sometimes you get to the point where you're like, these people are just enemies, and my only option here is to win, right? Well, I think what I'm trying to push is to say that is sort of the option of last recourse, rather than jumping to a place of like, these are my enemies and I just have to beat them. Like, is it possible to spend time in the place of maybe there are real losses of power that we have to talk about what it means to give up our power to other people? Maybe there are real losses of identity. Can we spend time with that? We've been, because this series is about gender, we've been thinking here about what does it mean for men to give up their power to women and people of other genders. But I think also a lot for myself as a white person and a person who grew up with economic privilege, what does it mean for me to do the work of learning how to let go of those things and share them with other people? And I would hope that the people who are leading, charges for racial justice and charges for economic justice in our communities would not just say, well, Sarah's the enemy, let's beat her. And would say like, okay, you don't deserve it, but I'm going to give you some time to do this work. I hope we would start there. And Judy, I think you're right. Sometimes the day comes where you're just like, this person is not in this process at all. They are just stalling for the sake of stalling. And at some point, the conversation becomes one about winning and losing. But what I'm trying to push with this Torah here is like, maybe that's move 3 or 4. Let's hopefully it's not move 1, because that kind of scorched earth policy does a lot of damage too. Sometimes it's the only way forward, but I hope we don't start there.
Natalie has her hand up too.
Yeah,
Natalie.
Judy, do you want to respond? And then I'll go to Natalie.
I just did. Yes, I just wanted to say, going back to the very beginning about different attitudes about things, different visions, different the way people observe things. I know, and I have a very good example. I have a very close friend for 30, 40 years. And when things were going so bad, I said, boy, what about the good old days? The 50s, the 60s. Well, my friend is Black. And she didn't see good old days as good old days. So everybody
right. That's such a great example. Like, who's good old days? Like people sometimes like to play that game. Like, if you could live in any era of human history, like which one would you pick? And I always say, like, for me as a woman, like I can't go back very far. Like, I would choose like the era in which I can have my own credit card and like vote, and like also, the like indoor plumbing. Like, I just like, it's not a fun game for me. It's not a fun game for me. And I think, Black people also like, the 50s is not a fun game for them.
Right.
Those weren't good old days. They were just old days. Right.
Right.
Natalie, yes, please come on in.
Yeah. What I was going to say, it's so naive to believe that change doesn't mean change. Like, we're not going back there. And that's a very hard realization. So people, even in the changes that we've made in our society, which are not as great as we might like, there have been real losses. There are groups who have suffered real losses. And it's not going to be almost like it used to be. It's going to be very different. And people are going to have to learn to adjust. What's interesting to me as I was thinking about this, because I've sort of followed what's been going on between men and women in leadership and Judaism, and that is for a while, and we're not seeing this. What's going to happen to our men? I mean, maybe we've stopped talking about it, or maybe I'm just not in the circles that are talking about it. That's also a possibility. But we see the numbers of female rabbis, the changes that have been made in all sorts of places in Judaism. And whereas we don't have very many female CEOs of major Jewish organizations, there are other places where the rabbinic leadership and the lay leadership are women in numbers that we never would have imagined years ago.
Amazing. Yes. Okay. I love that comment, Natalie. I want to respond 3 different pieces. So the first piece, where you started, I want to just reflect that when I've taught this material, I've had some people say that it is just way too optimistic, like it's so optimistic that I would assume that the people who are resisting the changes I'm trying to make in the community are really good people. And really, if I give them time and I work with them, they'll get there. Like, how could you be so naively optimistic? And I've had other people say, like, what a pessimistic lesson you're teaching here. And I think inherently the second group is right, because I am a pessimist insofar as I do not believe that most of the time there are win-win answers, in the sense of an answer that everyone is going to feel good about and no one's going to have to give anything up. Like, some people are going to lose some of the things that they are used to having, and they are going to feel pain and loss about that. And I think that the people who lead movements for change have gotten a little too seduced with this sort of win-win language. Like, it's going to be great for everybody. The promised land is flowing with milk and honey. Like, of course the promised land is flowing with milk and honey. Of course. But like, if we can't be honest about the fact that there are losses, we're not being honest. We're not being good leaders. Like, some people are going to have to let go. That's thing one. I think thing two is, I want to just, in terms of your point about male rabbis, I think, and I read an article, I think in the New York Times, that's basically the only thing I read recently, about a statistic that, like, I'm going to misquote this, but like 1/4 of American men say they don't have any close friends. Like, I think straight cisgendered men are actually in a really bad place right now. And I think, like, as a community, as a rabbi, as a mother of a son, I worry about our men a lot. And I actually think trying to rebuild a healthy masculinity and a healthy space for men who care about that identity and feel like men, but also that isn't toxic and isn't harmful to themselves and others, is like a huge challenge for the next generation. And I think, like, the rabbinate is a great example of, like, we don't maybe need the kinds of male rabbis we had 100 years ago, but we still need male rabbis. Like, there are gifted young men and middle-aged men and men of all ages who have so much to bring to our community. And how can we help them step into those leadership roles in ways that are authentic to who they are and their gender, but maybe a little different than the way men led 100 years ago. And there was a third thing, but I no longer remember what it was. Where did you end your comment, Natalie? You were talking about
leadership.
Yes, leadership. Yes, I think
leadership.
the last thing I wanted to say is that I think you're exactly right. It is so interesting to notice that the rabbinate outside of Orthodoxy, now we see equal numbers of men and women in our rabbinical schools. I think now there are more female rabbinical students in the Reform movement than male ones. Like, there are so many spaces in which women and people of all genders are really stepping up as leaders. And that corner office, the sort of CEO of major Jewish organizations, is as white and as male as it's ever been. And I wonder, is that going to shift over time? If not, why not? Is it because maybe some of us look at those jobs and say those jobs themselves are terrible and unsustainable, and I don't want those jobs? Like, what are the dynamics there? But you're so right to name that as a real phenomenon in our community. I mean, I think the statistic is like 80% of Jewish professionals are women, and like 20% of Jewish professionals in the top job in their organization are women.
Sarah,
So
you have one more question. I want to make sure there's time.
Totally. So something is totally broken there. So thank you, Natalie. Yes, Sarah, last question.
I just wanted to make a comment about how
Comment. Great. Do it.
we were talking about this very issue around protecting our synagogues, ironically, right before Colleyville happened, with a community, B'nai Jeshurun, that I'm a part of from afar, who I've discovered, and they're amazing. And there was literally a community-wide discussion on how to protect, our synagogues, and how a police presence, really affects Jews of color, and how, but that, what do we do, and how do we protect people without intimidating and causing trauma and hurt to others. So was definitely a, very relevant.
Yeah, I think that's such a helpful comment in terms of this piece of my pessimism. As an optimist, my pessimism that there are options that don't have trade-offs. As we've talked about, I run a Jewish community out of my home, and the whole power of it is to be home-based for young people who would never walk into a place that feels institutional, but will come for my Shabbos table or come to learn with me. And I'm now being told by my funders that I should be checking IDs at the door and I think, of course, I really appreciate that comes from a place of my organizational sponsors really caring about me and my family, wanting to keep us safe. And it doesn't feel very homey if somebody's checking your ID at the door and patting you down on the way to my Shabbos dinner. So I think it's a great example of the ways in which A, there are always trade-offs, and B, those trade-offs, Sarah, as you've lifted up so powerfully, don't play out equally. And for Jews of color who may have a different kind of relationship with policing, it's so much more so.
Yeah,
so
I think there's two. I mean, Sarah, I think with many of these things, it's sometimes hard to go to the middle place, but for example, you could have people pre-register, for your events. So then you have names. So then you can do at least a little, right. Yeah. So there are, and also it's when we had our first child, the pediatrician's you take what I say, and then some of it you decide on your own what you're going to do and doing. I'm going
to invite you, Rabbi Jessica, to my advisory committee. Everybody can come and give me advice about how to deal with our security problems. But I just, as a closing thought, because I know we're out of time, I just want to offer, we've really been on a journey here through the question of what would it look like to expand and be more robust and diverse about who leads the Jewish community? What would it look like to be more creative about when really the work of Judaism is to make us feel rooted in the past, and when it is to embrace the future? And then this last sort of sad, but I think important and beautiful note of how do we care enough about all our people to hold everybody through the transition into what I feel, actually, here's the optimist in me, I feel sure will be a better, more equitable, more diverse, more just future. And how do we get there in a way that gets every single one of our people there, because we are people and we love each other, because I think the promised land is flowing with milk and honey, and I think it's going to be really great. So thank you all for being on this 3-part journey with me. And I will throw my email in the chat. I hope to continue to hear from you all and continue to learn with you all. And thank you. I'll just say one last thank you to Rabbi Jessica for bringing me into this amazing space, and for everything you do to serve your community and to be an incredible paradigm of a female, brilliant, innovative, traditional, amazing rabbi. So thank you,
Sarah. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to learn with you. I think you put an E instead of a. Oh no, is that right? That's the E.
That's right.
Got it.
E for great. Elizabeth.
Got it. Perfect. A couple things, just a couple quick things. One is how this came about is in the end we're moving it to remote, but we have a documentary filmmaker who'll be speaking about a documentary she made in March. She'll be speaking called Women in Blue, which is how women police differently than men. And we're working with a congregant who works in the police world about talking to police women about all this. So the event's still happening. It'll just be remote now. So this is just a great kind of way to think about power and gender and things like that. And that will continue when that documentary comes for a remote event. And then we just want to thank Jake, our awesome producer. And we're just going to share the slide that's going to talk about our next Lunch and Learn. One of the blessings of living in South Florida is a lot of people come to Florida to live or to retire. And that is the case with Harvey Levin. He's an educator, Jewish educator. He's been in Detroit. He's been in Washington, D.C. He's been, I think, in Jacksonville. And he's now part of the Bethel community. And he will be teaching us in the month of February about the making of modern Israel and security and society. So we're looking forward to having him for Lunch and Learn. We want to thank everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. And once again, Rabbi, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to spend time with you, and stay warm in Chicago. And hopefully, we will continue these conversations for sure. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Rabbi,
Thank you, Rabbi.
That documentary sounds super interesting. How do I find out about that and when it's happening?
It's if you go to here, I'll put our tbeboca.org and just register to get our emails.
Okay.
Then
Okay.
I gotta find the chat. Hold on, where's
Yeah,
my
because that
chat
sounds
button?
super interesting. Gotcha.
You can, it's
Okay.
called Women in Blue. I'll just put it here. And then if you go to tbeboca.org, that's our synagogue, and you can get notified when
Okay.
things going on. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds super interesting.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
When
you.
does the new lunch and learn start?
Next Tuesday. They're always Tuesday from noon to 1. We take time off sometimes if there's a holiday. But Harvey's, I think, all month long. I'm just looking through my calendar. Yeah, he's all month long.